Hello and welcome to another episode of Blissful Consults with Dr. Cammy. Let's jump right into our first question. We have some amazing questions today, and I'm very excited to get started. This is from Justine in California. Justine says, I really like my therapist as a person, but I am not a big fan of my therapist as a therapist. Well, that is a dilemma. Every session feels like a coffee check-in with a friend. She ahs me to the point that sometimes I wonder if she's really listening. I thought therapists were supposed to give tools, strategies, and advice to help you meet your goals. Am I being too hard on my therapist, or is she phoning it in? This is a question I get all the time for people who book new consults with me. Frequently, individuals are moving from a previous therapist over to a new therapist because they're not satisfied with what their therapist is providing. And I have a few thoughts on this. So, to Justine's question, am I being too hard on my therapist, or is my therapist phoning it in? I would say it depends, and I know that that's a bit of a cop-out answer, but we're gonna go into it, and so I hope you will have some guidance by the end of this. So it's important to note that all therapists have a whole wide range of different styles. With that said, we as therapists, as counselors, are obligated and required through our ethical boards and through our behavioral science laws. So each state has different laws that govern how therapists actually engage in their practice. And so all of our styles actually have to fit within the ethical and legal statutes of whatever governing body we connect with. So for me, I'm a marriage and family therapist, so I abide by the ethics of the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy. I practice in California, and so I operate under the laws and stipulations outlined by the Board of Behavioral Sciences. So whatever our styles are has to sort of fit into those paradigms. And so I would say that there's a lot of different ways a therapist can go about things, but there are some trademark hallmark features of therapy that should be present regardless of the modality that a therapist uses. And I train therapists, I work with therapists, and I think the vast majority of therapists are actually doing these things. And I'm going to explain them in a minute, but I don't think most therapists are actually explaining that to clients. So let me just give you an example. So, and sometimes we have insurance regulations that sort of require this of us. But if you're going to a therapist, this is considered, a medical psychological session. And so there needs to be, there should be a diagnosis of some kind that the therapist is working under. So this could be a DSM diagnosis, meaning the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which we can talk about later. So this is a medical diagnosis that the therapist is assigning. Ideally, the therapist would actually work with you to figure out what diagnosis really fits with your symptoms. A lot of times the diagnosing process is done behind closed doors. I think because therapists are sometimes wary to engage in that conversation, they're not sure how, and sometimes clients don't ask. I believe it's on the onus of the therapist to actually initiate that conversation, but sometimes they do not. I think often they do not. So even if, let's say you're paying out of pocket and you might not have a DSM diagnosis, so you might not have a medical diagnosis. Insurance companies will require a diagnosis more often than not to get reimbursed and paid. If you're in a medical facility, they're often requiring a diagnosis. But if you're paying out of pocket, a therapist doesn't always need to assign a diagnosis. With that said, I do think it's important that you have an understanding of what are the symptoms, what are the issues that you're addressing in therapy. So if it's connected to a diagnosis, that might be generalized anxiety disorder. It might be depression. It might be post-traumatic stress disorder. If you're not working under a medical diagnosis, a psychological diagnosis, that might be symptoms. It might be symptoms of chronic worry that maybe don't meet the threshold for anxiety. It might be symptoms of withdrawal or sadness that don't meet the threshold for major depressive disorder. It might be feelings of avoidance and overwhelm when you're in social situations. So the first part of having, I think, being in a therapy relationship where you know and understand what's going on is to have a clear understanding. What is the therapist helping you with? And you might have an understanding that's different than the therapist. And so actually explicitly having that conversation. And just by the way, therapists are required to have this written down for every single session. So your therapist has it written, has an idea of it somewhere. So that would be the first thing, is really figuring out what are we working on and making that explicit. And then the second thing a therapist has to have by ethical and legal standards is a treatment plan. And just like anything in life, the treatment plan can be kind of skimpy and sparse and just meet the bare requirements for documentation, or it can be a rich working document that the therapist and the client create together in order to meet the goals for the issue that you're addressing. The treatment plan is something, at least for me, it's something very important because it helps myself and the client have some kind of a therapy arc and to understand where are we starting, where are we going, and then what are the things you're going to be doing and I'm going to be doing to help us get to the end of this beautiful rainbow that is your goals in your life. I think, some clients, when I do initial consults with clients who are dissatisfied with their current therapist, I ask them, what are your goals and what are the strategies that your therapist is using and that you are using and implementing to help you get to your goals? And they don't know. They're not sure because every session feels just kind of like a brief check-in. They might, you might talk about your week. I don't even know. Some clients that I talk to, they talk to their therapist about like TV shows and fashion. And I don't think that's wrong. I also think it should be a small portion of any given meeting unless it's connected to a coping skill. So like talking about TV shows, talking about fashion, sure, that might be a coping skill around engagement with the therapist and relationship building. That's one of the first goals we have in therapy. And sometimes that looks like small talk. Yes, when I ask like, hey, how'd you spend your weekend? What was that restaurant like? This is just a way to connect, a way to build trust as the foundation with which we're going to do a lot more to help you get to your goals. So I would say knowing what you're doing in your meetings and how that's moving toward a goal is very important. Let me just see. There was one more thing I wanted. Oh, super important. So Justine said, am I being too hard on my therapist or is she phoning it in? And Justine says, every session feels like a coffee check-in with a friend. So your therapy sessions, I don't want to say should. I'm just going to say should. I think they should. They should include some element of content and some element of process. So if you saying to your therapist, hey, when we talk about random things in our therapy session, when we talk about TV shows, when we talk about fashion, when we talk about X, Y, and Z, I don't really like talking about those things. This is talking about content. So you are making an assessment of the content of your visits. Similarly, as a therapist, I might say to a client, hey, you know what I notice is that whenever we get together for our meeting, it seems like you're really interested in talking about X, Y, and Z. It's just a reflection on content. And I think when I see people dissatisfied with their therapy, it's generally because the focus is on content. And what therapy should be doing in part is looking at process. So basically, Justine, who I'm so grateful for writing this question, she's talking to me about process with her therapist. So she could practice with her therapist saying, hey, when we only talk about superficial things, like I'm on a little coffee date with my friend, it makes me feel like you're not really invested in my growth and development as a person. It feels like I'm just your buddy as opposed to someone who you're committed to helping be her best self. Is that clear, sort of that difference between content and process? And what clients yearn for is discussion about process, because that's often what gets squished down in our daily life, is the reflection on, hey, partner, when I ask you how your day was and you say good and walk away, that makes me feel like I'm not important to you. As opposed to content, hey partner, I just asked you how your day was. Give me more. I want to know details, right? This is process versus content. It's much more difficult and more vulnerable to focus on process. And I think clients look to their therapist to lead those discussions. Okay, that's I think. So last thoughts on this. I don't think you're being too hard on your therapist, but I do think you need to give your therapist a little bit of a chance before you just cut all ties. And what I would recommend is the next time you go to your therapist, you say, hey, I was really thinking about our time together, and I want our sessions to look a little bit different because they seem too superficial for the growth that I'm looking for in my life. And so I was curious about what are your goals for me? What do you have a treatment plan? Do you have a thought on where we started and where we're going? Do you mind if I see that? Have you given me a diagnosis? What are you operating on in terms of what we're working on? Are you operating with a diagnosis? Are you operating with a set of symptoms? How is our therapy structured? Do you mind sharing that with me? That is a very, very normal, appropriate question that any therapist, I think, should have addressed on their own. But if they haven't, all good. Get your needs met. And then I think see how that conversation goes and then get back to me.